Welcome to the debate. The material we're looking at today sets up a really fascinating clash. It goes way beyond just, geometry. While the formal motion is this house believes that the Earth is flat, the real core of it, the intellectual substance, is about epistemology. Basically, how do we decide what's true when what our senses tell us seems to conflict with, well, highly complex knowledge from institutions? So the central question we're tackling is this. Should we place more trust in complex instruments and the evidence given to us by authorities, or is there a strong, evidence-based reason to prioritize skepticism rooted in our direct, everyday observations? I'll be arguing for the position that centers on skepticism towards that kind of centralized institutional evidence.
I'll be championing the idea that what we can directly observe should take philosophical priority, and that it's intellectually necessary to question our trust in complex instruments.
And I'm coming at this from, well, a slightly different angle. Look, rigorous skepticism is absolutely vital for good science, I agree. But I maintain that when you're dealing with phenomena on a global scale, the evidence itself has to be global. So I'll be articulating the counter-arguments. These are based on the, frankly, profound predictive power of the spherical model, the way independent evidence from many different fields converges, and the scientific need for parsimony, the idea that, well, the flat Earth alternative requires an incredibly complex, frankly extraordinary global conspiracy to even work.
Okay. My position, fundamentally, rests on a core intellectual commitment, and that is that true knowledge should stem from evidence we can gather directly. Things that are repeatable, observable with low-tech means, rather than demanding we just, trust these vast, complex reports from instruments operated by distant authorities we never meet. If we rely on our immediate, daily experience, and I think this is a critical starting point, the horizon looks flat, demonstrably so, from our perspective. Moreover, when observers watch ships or other objects disappear over the horizon, proponents of the alternative view argue this phenomenon is actually entirely consistent with the rules of perspective. An object just diminishes with distance until you can't see it anymore. It doesn't have to be hidden by curvature. So we really have to address why the basic, observable world seems to contradict the model we're all taught.
That's an interesting point about the immediate appearance of the world. But I'd frame the issue of historical institutional failure a bit differently. Yes, history definitely shows us that scientific consensus can be wrong. Geocentrism is the classic case, right? But modern science, it's built on far more rigorous, independent, and distributed validation methods. The model that really stands up to this level of scrutiny is the oblate spheroid. Now, this model is supported by a huge body of evidence, independent evidence from multiple domains, geodesy, navigation, astronomy, and it has incredibly powerful predictive capabilities. We aren't just relying on images, though. I mean, we have countless independent images and even live video feeds showing curvature. From the ISS, various space probes, even private satellite companies now. But beyond just pictures, we rely on hard metrics like geodetic measurements. We use techniques like satellite laser ranging, very long baseline interferometry, VLBI, which essentially uses synchronized signals from atomic clocks to measure distances across continents, down to the millimeter level. These precise, repeatable measurements consistently match the oblate spheroid model. And I think crucially, the functional success of technologies derived from this model, things like satellite communications, predicting orbits, GPS, that provides perhaps the strongest practical validation you could ask for. They just work based on this geometry.
I appreciate you bringing up those precise measurements, but let's tackle that conflict of scale head-on, because this is really where the skeptical argument gains traction. If the Earth is a sphere, with a radius of, about 6,371 kilometers, why is the curvature so difficult to detect with the naked eye? Why isn't it obvious in simple, repeatable, low-tech experiments? If the spherical model is so solid, why hasn't mainstream science produced a straightforward, irrefutable demonstration? Something like, say, using high-powered lasers across a very long stretch of still water that could satisfy a non-expert observer directly. The standard explanation, of course, is that the curve is too slight to be seen locally. But that's precisely the challenge, isn't it? The burden, I think, falls on the spherical model to adequately explain why its defining characteristic is effectively undetectable using easily replicable, personal methods. It feels like the argument forces us to defend an unobserved curve through, well, faith in a complex mathematical formula rather than through direct sight.
I'm sorry, but I just don't agree that the failure of anecdotal local observation is a weakness of the spherical model. This expectation, the idea that curvature should be obvious on a small scale, is actually, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the geometry involved. The spherical model predicts that local curvature will be negligible precisely because the Earth is so vast. Its radius is over 6,000 kilometers. This means, practically, you'd only expect to see about, 8 inches of drop over a 3-mile distance? Expecting to see that curve from your backyard isn't a failure of the physics, it's a failure of understanding observational scale. But if we shift focus from purely local observation to truly global phenomena, the spherical geometry alone provides elegant, falsifiable proof. Consider something noted even by the ancient Greeks, the Earth's shadow cast upon the moon during a lunar eclipse. It is always circular, consistently circular, regardless of the Earth's orientation in space as it rotates. Now, for a flat disk model, to cast a perfectly circular shadow every single time, irrespective of its angle to the sun, that would require some incredibly elaborate, coincidental alignment that is frankly geometrically absurd. The sphere explains this global observation simply, consistently, and it's testable every time there's an eclipse.
Okay, that point about the lunar eclipse providing consistent, non-local data is certainly, well, compelling, partly because it doesn't seem to require complex instrumental trust, at least not in the way modern data does. However, connecting that ancient observation directly to the trustworthiness of modern authoritative data, that still requires a bit of a leap of trust, doesn't it? And this brings us right back to the core epistemic conflict: institutional trust versus, let's say, raw data access. When space agencies admit, and they do, they have to, that they use image composites or processing or enhancements, sometimes for technical reasons, sometimes just for clarity or aesthetics, well, the audience is no longer accepting evidence based purely on raw, verifiable, objective data. Right? They are accepting the evidence based on the testimony of the institution about why they processed it that way, what the intent was. This institutional control over how information is presented, potentially driven by incentives like funding or maintaining public consensus, it demands that institutional evidence be scrutinized with the highest degree of skepticism. When the raw footage isn't fully accessible or it requires institutional translation, it creates an epistemic gap. And into that gap, skepticism will inevitably, and perhaps rightly, take root.
I absolutely acknowledge the need for scrutiny of institutional sources, especially when it comes to processed imagery. That's healthy scientific practice. However, the intellectual leap from, okay, some images are stitched together or enhanced for technical or aesthetic reasons, to, therefore, the entire global data set is a deliberate hoax, that leap is, well, it's illogical. Finding anomalies or processing artifacts in a few images doesn't justify dismissing the entire vast independent body of data that converges on a spherical Earth. We have to remember, the evidence for the sphere isn't just NASA photos. It's incredibly multifaceted. We rely on things like radar altimetry from satellites mapping the ocean surface precisely. We have footage from countless amateur high-altitude balloon launches that clearly show curvature as they ascend. And then there are basic astronomical observations, like how the visible stars shift predictably in the sky as you travel north or south between hemispheres. Now, if we follow your line of reasoning about deep skepticism of institutions, sustaining a global hoax of this magnitude requires an unbelievable level of coordinated suppression across rival nations and agencies, NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, the Chinese Space Agency, plus thousands upon thousands of independent pilots navigating great circles, engineers building satellites, and amateur astronomers tracking them all, relying on spherical physics every single day. This scenario, it requires an extraordinary number of extraordinary assumptions. And that's where the principle of parsimony, or Occam's razor, comes in. Parsimony dictates we should choose the simplest explanation that covers all the known facts, the one requiring the fewest unnecessary assumptions. Claiming a multi-decade global conspiracy spanning rival nations and industries is vastly less plausible. It's scientifically far less parsimonious than the accepted physics that consistently explains all these independent observations without needing a conspiracy.
The parsimony argument is powerful, I grant you that. But it relies on what feels like an unbroken chain of trust in every single one of those thousands of independent actors you mentioned. And that trust, isn't it predicated on their initial acceptance of the premise, the validity of the sphere itself? If they start from that assumption, their work will naturally reinforce it.
Okay, let me directly challenge the internal consistency and, crucially, the predictive power of the alternative flat model against how the world demonstrably works. When we're testing scientific models, predictive failure is, well, it's usually fatal. So we have to ask, how does the typical flat disk model, which often posits a localized sun sort of moving in circles above the disk, how does that model produce the highly precise, consistent, and predictable patterns of time zones we observe, or the exact sunrise and sunset times that vary perfectly with latitude and season across the globe? Furthermore, think about the sheer functional utility of the spherical model in global logistics. How does a flat map explain the elegant, precise, and verifiably most efficient paths for long-haul flights, the Great Circle routes? Consider the shortest route from Santiago, Chile to Sydney, Australia. On any standard flat map projection, that route looks bizarrely long and curved. Yet on a globe, it's essentially a straight line, the shortest distance. The reliance of the entire global air travel industry on spherical geometry for efficiency and fuel saving isn't just testimony. It's millions of successful, predictive events happening every single day.
I see why you lean heavily on those real-world successes, yes. But we need to perhaps reframe the complexity that's assumed to be required for those systems to function as described. Flat Earth models can theoretically handle day-night cycles. They do this by positing the sun not as a distant star, but as a much smaller, local, sort of spotlight-like source moving above the plane. This shrinks the effective area of illumination, creating a moving hotspot of light that produces day and night patterns without requiring orbital mechanics around a sphere. But let's get to your technological challenge, things like GPS, satellite communications, global flight routing. Proponents of the alternative view might argue that these could simply be misunderstood systems. For the average person, they are the ultimate black box, right? We use them, they work, but we have to simply accept the official explanation of how they work.
What if these navigational grids aren't actually based on satellites orbiting a sphere? What if they are perhaps incredibly sophisticated networks of ground-based towers synchronized across the world? Or maybe high-altitude balloons or drones acting as localized relays, mimicking satellite behavior? This reframing, you see, forces the defender of the standard model to defend the entire chain of authority, the immense complexity, and the hundreds of millions of precise calculations that are required for these systems to function exactly as described by the institutions. We are fundamentally challenging the assumption that functional success automatically equates to truth about the underlying physical mechanism. Are we, the public, truly understanding the black box of GPS? Or are we simply accepting the authoritative explanation for why our phone knows where we are?
That's a robust philosophical challenge about the nature of trusting complex systems, the black box problem. I acknowledge that. But ultimately, isn't it a challenge about how the system works in its intricate details, rather than if it works? Or, more importantly, what geometry its functioning requires?
The theoretical possibility of some elaborate, globally synchronized high-altitude balloon grid that perfectly mimics the physics of orbital mechanics around a sphere. Well, that is exactly the kind of unparsimonious, incredibly complex ad hoc assumption that science generally rejects. Why invent and maintain a vastly complicated, non-orbital structure that must be meticulously coordinated across the entire globe, involving potentially millions of hidden components, when the straightforward physics of gravity and orbital motion explains the observed functionality perfectly using known principles?
And fundamentally, let's not forget, amateur astronomers
independent radio operators tracking satellites, even surveyors using GPS for precise land measurements for decades. These groups have used equipment and techniques that independently verify orbital mechanics and the spherical model. This is evidence that, anyone with the skills and equipment can test, largely without relying on direct institutional testimony from NASA or ESA. It's evidence that exists somewhat outside the official narrative control you're concerned about.
Ultimately, I think our debate really boils down to this. Is the philosophical drive for rigorous personal skepticism combined with the evidence of our direct, low-tech experience a sufficient intellectual counterweight to the, let's face it, overwhelming authority of institutional science? The spherical model, as presented, demands immense, unbroken, decades-long trust. Trust in distant agencies, in complex mathematics most people don't fully grasp, and in selectively provided, often composite, imagery. When faced with that demand for trust, the historical reality that scientific consensus can be wrong, combined with the deep-seated need for knowledge that feels directly verifiable rather than merely accepted on expert testimony, well, that remains a compelling and intellectually viable basis for doubt. We must, I believe, always question the complexity we are required to simply trust.
And I'd argue the spherical model prevails precisely because it trusts evidence that anyone can and indeed does test, often regardless of institutions. Think about the Coriolis effect, right? The observable fact that large weather systems and ocean currents rotate clockwise in the southern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the northern. This perfectly matches the physics of fluid dynamics on a rotating sphere, and it's very hard to explain simply on a flat, stationary disk. Or, as we discussed, the consistent evidence from lunar eclipses, visible to everyone. The spherical model trusts evidence that makes highly accurate, falsifiable predictions for orbital paths, for navigation, for tides, predictions that fail immediately and demonstrably under the simplified flat model. So while skepticism is absolutely vital, it's the engine of science. The flat model requires adopting the extraordinary and, I argue, entirely unnecessary assumption of a multi-decade global conspiracy of silence spanning nations, industries, and independent scientists. It fundamentally fails the scientific test of parsimony, and critically, it lacks the predictive accuracy required to even begin to overturn such a well-established, convergent scientific consensus built on centuries of observation and measurement. I think the strength of this entire exercise really is recognizing that there are strong intellectual foundations for both approaches to how we validate knowledge, whether you prioritize personal, empirical experience and skepticism of authority, or you rely on the convergence of independent predictive data across multiple complex domains. It really compels all of us, I hope, to weigh the quality, the source, and the independence of evidence presented, whether it comes from a major institution or from our own direct observations,